the young folks who gave Biden an edge in swing states, young people and everywhere, young people and people of color, Asian American voters, Arab American voters, Muslim voters, like especially in those swing states, and which are like, the fastest growing block of voters in this country next to Latinos. But that's what gave him the edge. And he's losing that particular edge. So I guess I wanted to ask you, like, what weight do you put on these actions and his, stance around Israel's war on Gaza?
Yeah, massive weight, I think. I think like this is a horrible miscalculation from the White House and the Biden administration to side closer with the Netanyahu government than an overwhelming majority of Democratic voters. And so it's like functionally siding with the Trump government in Israel. It's just baffling to me to see you get polls that say 80% of Democrats support a ceasefire, Republicans support a ceasefire, independents support a ceasefire, Democrats oppose sending more weapons to Israel, and to go there and say absolutely nothing and go from the White House and do a speech that says we must have humanitarian pauses and we must send $14 billion in bombs and weapons. It's just no one is buying the shit he's selling. And it's just baffling to me to see young voters everywhere be like, we have always been at the center of the pro-peace movement for generations in this country. We are once again that. Today, Sunrise Movement, Gen Z for Change, and a bunch of other groups that represent young voters put out a letter to Biden saying, you need to call for a ceasefire, otherwise you are going to lose this election. So I think it's pretty clear that this is a massive albatross for him.
Absolutely. And it is, it also feels like this is a voting bloc that always gets shat on. I mean, other than maybe Black voters, and we can talk about that. I mean, but yeah, let's just broadly, young voters and voters of color, no matter, usually when it's a loss, always get blamed. And when they make the difference and help people win, it's us who have to be like, we helped you win. We're the reason. But then, and this was, and you obviously were, in 2020, we saw the like, oh my God, we're in a pandemic. Biden's in a basement or whatever, like what is this? And then, George Floyd is murdered, and a massive outpouring of people, young people, people of color, take the streets. And that energy, although Biden has never acknowledged this, the energy actually funnels into him, not because people wanted Biden to save us, but because we saw fascism in the streets through Trump and, basically henchmen of Trump, police, extrajudicial killings. Like, we saw a glimpse of what it could, really will be. And it funneled into Biden. And what did we get? Nothing around police reform. I mean, absolutely nothing. So all to say, here you have another mass movement, biggest protest for Palestine in American history in DC. And where is this energy? Where does that energy go? Right? It's sort of, there is no place for it to go other than, I think, electoral demobilization. But anyway, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think every cycle we see for a year, for 2 years, for 3 years, Democratic leadership basically say screw you to the entire populations that get them elected. And then come October of an election year, they're like, hey, here we are. Here's our Black surrogates. Here's our young surrogates. You guys support us, right? And no one is going to buy that anymore. People are far too aware of how this political system works. They are far too understanding that the president, for the first time in a very long time, had a speech from the Oval Office, and it was about sending billions in dollars to Israel, when a majority of voters in that New York Times Siena poll talk about how the thing they care about the most is jobs and the economy. And they are seeing billions of dollars go to another country's military to commit ethnic cleansing. And they are wondering why that money is not being invested in their communities. And I think you're not just seeing that in young voters, you're seeing that especially in communities of color who are constantly just like, when are we going to get our fair share of this billions that we are evidently building a massive deficit for. It seems like it's only lining the pockets of corporate defense contractors. And once again, we are doing that again. There's no mass mobilization to give jobs to a bunch of people in Black and brown communities. The only thing we are seeing bipartisan support for right now is arming the Israeli military. And it is deeply unpopular. No one is here for it, and no one is lived through the last 2 decades of failed endless wars, especially young voters, and saw us going to Afghanistan to eradicate the Taliban, and then the day after we leave, the Taliban is back in power. No one thinks a military conflict is going to resolve what's going on in Israel and Palestine, and that is why everybody supports a ceasefire. It is the bare minimum to end violence. I was reading yesterday about, I mean, obviously there's been, over 4,000 children who've been murdered by the Israeli military. Yesterday, I saw them report about a Palestinian baby who was issued a death certificate before their birth certificate. And it's just like, voters are seeing that every day, and they are not pretending like this is justified Israeli defense. They see this as straight up ethnic cleansing, as straight up punishing civilians for the actions of Hamas. And there's no ways about it.
I can't. You know what, when you said we're killed, I just think it's so important, because I've heard, and maybe even I even said, 4,000 have died. We need to eradicate this passive voice. And this is a complete sidebar, but they're killed. They were murdered. They were killed. Also, those 1,400 civilians and military personnel in Israel were killed. So we say the same thing. Just because it falls from the sky doesn't mean it's not still murder. But anyway, to your point about, let's look a little bit at that Siena poll. This is just a summary of it by New York Times and Siena College, determined that Biden's support base is fracturing as voters are dissatisfied with his immigration, national security, and economic policies. The Times poll found that African-American voters are expressing an unusually high 22% for Trump. And Biden is also hemorrhaging support from younger voters, Hispanics, and urban voters. In swing states, 67% of registered voters say that the country is moving in the wrong direction. Oh, this is generally. And then in swing states, Trump is beating Biden 49-43 in Georgia, 49-44 in Arizona, 48-43 in Michigan, 48-44 in Pennsylvania, and even holds a stunning double-digit lead in Nevada, 52-41, which is wild. Biden currently has the lead in Wisconsin, but just barely, with 47% to Trump's 45%. Before we go into that, let's just zero in on Michigan and this, Justice Dems. Well, Waleed of Justice Dems, who's been on this show, sent this around from Lake Research Partners, which I guess is a Biden polling company. They work with them, right? So 71% of Michigan Dems overall support ceasefire in Gaza. 71%. Under 30, only 61% would vote for Biden if the election were held today, which is interesting because 56% gave him a poor rating on the handling of Gaza. 43% said they continue vote third party in 2024 if the election were held between Trump and Biden. 73% oppose weapons aid packages to Israel. Only 62% of Michigan Dems say they'd vote to reelect Joe Biden if the election was held today. And then another addendum, RFK is actually ahead of Biden with Arab and Muslim Michigan Democrats. Now, I want to there is a lot happening here. So let's just pull it out, because I feel like let's just talk about the Arab and Muslim vote. It is very easy for people whose communities are not affected or whose identities are not immediately politicized as they walk down the streets or feel unsafe right now to say, well, why don't you realize Trump is worse? Why don't you just suck it up and vote for Biden? You're shooting yourself in the foot, blah, blah, blah. Right. We understand, that's, you can make that sort of cold calculated, a move here in voting for Biden over Trump. But on a visceral level, the idea that this president is putting you at risk and killing maybe family members abroad or helping in their murder, and there's no sign of slowing down. I just want everyone to appreciate how fucking attacked, I think American Muslim and Arabs feel and should possibly feel. I don't know. Your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Frankly, as an American, a Muslim, it is crazy to see like the attempted kind of collective gaslighting of the entire Arab and Muslim population in this country to somehow suck it up when they are watching dead babies pile up. That we saw, the same outrage when 1,400 innocent Israelis were murdered. That is the same outrage that we are all seeing happen in Muslim and Arab communities when they see and they check every day how many more thousands of people were just murdered by Israeli bombs and weapons. And to kind of put it on a community that is suffering to be like, well, you need to vote for the lesser of two evils is a insane thing, in my opinion, to put on that when really everyone should be mobilizing against the White House to say, maybe don't do these things that is making you lose voters. That is also just, like basic human rights, right?
Yes.
And so it is a crazy thing. I, just anecdotally from the Muslim community that I know from, I'm from Houston, Texas, and there's a massive Muslim community there, massive South Asian population there. And there are just so many people who are not politically active whatsoever, generally always Democrat, but are just like rock on Dems, whatever, especially post-Bush, and are seeing the same feelings they had in the wake of 9/11 after George W. Bush as like a party that is against Muslims with Biden and the White House, because that is what he's doing, having comments here and there about how you want to combat Islamophobia after a child in Chicago is stabbed to death by an Islamophobic person is just not going to cut it when they are watching you lobby for billions of dollars in bombs to kill more kids, in Palestine.
It's just a Band-Aid on a gaping wound that we can all see. Oh my God, you're assembling a task force on Islamophobia.
Thank goodness.
What a fucking shitlib thing to do. What a shitlib thing to do. And fuck you, because we know you're gonna back away from that in like a month when the right is like, this is actually anti-Semitism, and then you're like, you know what, it is, or they're doing terrorism, and like, you know what, we are, like, just the way they backed away from the misinformation task force or whatever the hell that was. It's like, anyway, I appreciate having this conversation with you, Osama, because I know you, and with Justice Dems, you are fundamentally an organization that believes that even within our, duopoly, that we can affect change and that we should be working to make this change. And so I appreciate being able to go here with you, because it is not that, no one is acting irrationally. We are seeing what is happening, and we're saying that this is what's irrational. But I wanted to pick up on this piece with you because, so let's talk more broadly about independents. Independents are also incredibly against sending more weapons to Israel. They want a ceasefire as well. They want, a diplomatic solution. And it reminds me of, again, the post 9/11, legacy, which is the appetite for war in the United States between all voters, I'm not talking about party leaders, is next to nothing. After 8 wars with Bush, 8 wars, 8 years of Bush, 2+ wars, felt like 8 wars. The drone campaigns, the torture, the that bankrupted our economy. Everyone's sick of it. And it's partly why, first of all, it's why Obama got elected and over Hillary, and it's why Trump got elected. Because even though Trump does his whole, like, I wouldn't have gone into Iraq, and then it's like, without taking all the oil, and that's his version. But I guess I wanted to ask also about, like, how Democrats have sort of squandered the lane for peace. And I say that not in a, weak way, but I say it in, like, the lane to truly have robust diplomatic leadership around the world that doesn't come, again, with a bunch of bombs.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think the era of kind of a warmongering American population is over. There are people who are down to do it, but a majority of people have lived through just failed endless wars, have lived through seeing their kids get sent off to Fallujah and come back in body bags. And they are not interested in seeing another endless war in the Middle East. And Democrats, cosplay as these pro-peace activists, generally in contrast to the Republican Party. But like, it's a very small group of Democrats who are willing to stand up, and you named some of them, folks like Summer Lee and Cori Bush and Rashida and Jamal and AOC, who are very actively opposing endless wars and opposing sending $800 billion to the Department of Defense for corporate defense contractors, and who are calling for a ceasefire. But we have constantly let Democratic leadership, both in Congress and the White House and in the party, has always let this corporate defense industry push us around to say what we need to do. Because if you look at who Raytheon donated to at the beginning of this year, it was $30,000 to the Democratic committees and $30,000 to the Republican committees. And warmongering has always been bipartisan in Congress, and it doesn't help when you have an Israel lobby with AIPAC, the United Democracy Project, and the Democratic Majority for Israel, who is threatening millions of dollars in Democratic primaries if you stand up even an iota for basic Palestinian human rights, because that's what they did last cycle. They spent millions of dollars across a lot of races. We lost some of those races because AIPAC spent it. They spent it against Jessica Cisneros in defense of Henry Cuellar, famously anti-choice pro-NRA Democrat Henry Cuellar. And the only person who was able to beat them was Summer Lee, after beating back $5 million in the Democratic primary and a general election. And this is who the White House, this is who Democratic leadership is listening to, are folks who want to send billions more in unconditional military bombs and weapons to Israel, while the American people are just like, can we please have healthcare or anything?
Well, that's what's interesting. I mean, I wanted to kind of like, I guess, ask you about like, one, before we move on from the war and everything that's happening, I did want to ask whether you think, I've said that I think Biden is he's just knee-jerk when it comes to Israel. It's like he sees, for some reason, first of all, he's turned off his brain to what Israel has become and how far right it has actually moved, and how dead the peace process is. I mean, this is just such a murderous path. Blinken said on an interview, I'm never going to get over this, that there is no military solution to what's going on right now. And it's like, oh, okay, so what are we doing then? So what are we doing? If there's no, are you, okay, because you can't say both of those things at once, like, oh, Hamas is never, and I just have to get this point out. The last, when you see these headlines, man loses 25 members of his family. Woman loses 50 members of her family. What the fuck do we imagine the surviving members of these families are going to do? How do we imagine that they will continue? Number one, continue to live their lives at all. But number two, what isn't that just like, if anything were to radicalize you, if I lost 50 members of my family, I mean, could you really blame me in one fell swoop? Like, would you really hold it against me if I, started to resist a little bit more violently? Like, I'm just like, it's just incredible to me, the kind of groundwork for blowback that they are laying right now, and deliberately so. But we can move on from that. How much do you think that this is a political calculation for Biden to be like, well, there's more money from AIPAC? I never heard of a massively funded $1 billion Palestinian lobby, inshallah is what just wants to come out of my mouth. But, so this is just a calculation on that. Muslim and Arabs are a smaller voting bloc. They're a very critical voting bloc. They're a smaller voting bloc than American Jews, even though all American Jews are not on board with this. But many powerful ones are. This is my calculation. Do you feel like it is more of that cold calculation than anything?
Yeah, I mean, I can't understand what else it could possibly be at this point. I think we saw before October 7th, President Biden was unwilling to meet Netanyahu in the White House, was only going to meet him in public in New York City outside of the UN, because he was such a bad, corrupt figure that was getting protested by his own voters because he wanted to usurp democracy.
Right.
And so we have witnessed, once again, as usual, a massacre happened. And now we are just going to use any excuse to go to war. And he's not listening to voters. If this is a political calculation, you would see a poll that says 80% of voters call for a ceasefire, and the next day be like, all right, we got to call for a ceasefire, you know?
Right.
But clearly he is listening to these lobbies, which have always been extremely powerful. And there's an excerpt that's been circulating around Twitter from Obama's autobiography, talking very specifically about how AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, has always been this threatening kind of pack to anyone who talks about Israel, both in Congress and in the White House, and how we should always be aware of this threat and how we need to stamp this threat out. And we are seeing the same thing happen again. Every instance of kind of any movement towards stability in Palestine or Israel, any movement towards any solution and long-standing peace has always been opposed by the Israel lobby and its various super PACs. And they will spend millions and millions of dollars spreading misinformation about people like Rashida Tlaib, people like Summer Lee, to get their point across. And they will appeal to the worst nature of people. And I think people just aren't buying it anymore. You know, people hear about this. People understand how controlled our politics are by corporate lobbies. And the Israel lobby is no different from that. And they are just done with the moneyed interest in our politics and are looking for members and politicians who are actually fighting for their communities and not whoever has the biggest check.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/bitchuation room. Do it.